Hi there fabric jugglers, it's Babs here from Fiery Phoenix, and today's very short top tip is around seam allowances. What is a seam allowance, what can we use it for, and are there any standards, and how do I measure my seam allowance? Hopefully all of those will be answered in a minute. Basically, a seam allowance is the space between the edge of your fabric and your stitch line. So if you are creating a cushion, you put your two pieces of fabric together, and then within a certain distance of the edge of those two pieces of fabric, you're joining them together with a row of stitches, which are your seam, and the distance between that seam and the edge of the fabric is your seam allowance. Different projects will have different seam allowances, and generally when you are looking at a pattern, it will tell you whether that seam allowance is included in the pattern pieces or if you need to add that seam allowance on to the pattern pieces. It's very, very important that you pay attention to whether it's included or you have to add it on. One simply means you cut around or mark around and then cut the line of the pattern piece. The other is that you mark around the pattern piece and then you cut the extra amount of the seam allowance. So if it's a 1 inch seam allowance, you have to cut an inch away from the edge of that pattern piece. So you must read your patterns and the information very carefully for cutting to find out if that seam allowance is included or if it is not. The only standard seam allowance that I can actually think of off the top of my head is in quilting, where there is a standard 1/4 inch seam allowance. And that is so standard that some patterns don't even refer to it because it is just expected that everybody will know that quilting has a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it's worth me mentioning that here just in case you're going into quilting and you don't actually understand where it says leave a standard seam allowance or leave a standard SA. Doesn't mean sex appeal, although that could be quite interesting. It does mean seam allowance. And different techniques will need different size seam allowances. So as I say, for piecing within quilting, you would have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you are going to be creating a flat fell seam or a French seam, you may start with a large seam allowance and then cut that down to a much smaller seam allowance, so that you can then fold and manipulate the fabric before sewing again with a different size seam allowance. And I've got some examples of how to sew a French seam if that description started confusing you. I'll put a link to that somewhere around. And basically you sew the fabric one way, then you fold it over and close the raw edges and top stitch it down on the other side so that you have an enclosed seam. So you might start off with a 3/4 inch seam allowance and then you trim that down, fold it back, and then go for a half inch seam allowance, which encloses all those raw edges. And the same with a flat fell seam, where you're moving things back and forth and you're encasing your raw edges. So different types of seam will require different sizes of seam allowance, and different patterns made for different skill levels will also have different seam allowances built in. A seam allowance is also somewhere when you're transferring pattern markings that you can use pen marks to actually draw your pattern markings on, or you can use that gap or that seam allowance to actually create a notch, a physical notch within the fabric, or maybe the notch would be going out if you don't have a very large seam allowance. If you only have a 1/4 inch or less, then you'd want a notch pointing out of the fabric rather than pointing into the seam allowance, which is teeny tiny to begin with. Seam allowance is where you would also literally cut off a corner. So if you've got a corner of fabric that you've done a pivot turn on, then to reduce the amount of bulk within that corner, you'd then cut across at an angle, and the piece that you'd cut across is out of the seam allowance. And the same for snipping around corners. If you've got a curve, whether that be an inside curve or an outside curve, you would then snip through, not the stitches, but through the seam allowance to give that fabric extra movement and less bulk. So a seam allowance is actually quite important, although it can be dismissed quite easily as, oh, it's just seam allowance, it's just a number. But unless you understand why you need that number and why you need to pay attention to that number, you could be stacking up all sorts of problems for yourself with your next make. Hopefully that little tip has been of use to you, and if so, please share the video around I'd like to see you back again sometime soon, which would be lovely. I release videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays each week, and if you've got any suggestions for new topics or new tutorials that you'd like me to cover, please drop that in the message box below. If you've got any challenges you'd like me to undertake, then that would also be quite interesting. So again, drop me a comment, and hopefully I shall see you again soon. Bye for now.